In the previous episode, we discussed heat acclimatization and what happens to your body as it becomes acclimated. In this episode, we shall discuss how you can include heat acclimatization strategies into your training. Furthermore, we shall consider acute pre-cooling strategies that you could apply during race day or even during hard training days. So, let's start with a study investigating the effects of short-term acclimation to exercise in the heat. The purpose of this study was to determine the impact of short-term, so 5 days, heat acclimation on highly trained athletes. 8 male athletes were heat acclimated under controlled hypothermia conditions for 90 minutes on 5 consecutive days. Acclimation was undertaken with dehydration, so no fluid intake, during daily bouts of exercise. Participants completed a rowing-specific heat stress test at 35 degrees 1 day before and after the acclimation period. The heat stress test consisted of 10 minutes rowing at 30% peak power output and 10 minutes of rowing at 60% peak power output. Following a 5-minute rest, they then conducted a 2-kilometer performance test with no feedback from coaches or other athletes. Following the 5 days of heat acclimation, the heat stress test core temperature and cardiac frequency were lower after 20 minutes of exercise, so the 10 minutes combined. The 2-kilometer performance time trial improved by 4 seconds. Therefore, meaningful physiological and performance improvements occurred for highly trained athletes using a short-term 5-day heat acclimation under hypothermia with controlled dehydration. Rather than a short-term view, let's look at a bigger picture now. So, here is an example from an elite level triathlete who lives in San Francisco. The athlete trains mostly in cold and thermal neutral conditions, whereas the racing season is mainly in warm conditions in summer climates. In this table, you can see the first 9 weeks of the training season, including heat acclimatization. The athlete started the training season in January with traditional training, free from added environmental heat stress to enhance cardiorespiratory fitness. About 4 weeks prior to the first race of the season in heat, so race 1 here on the graphic, heat acclimation began. The objective of each exercise heat exposure training session was to sweat profusely and increase the core body temperature to at least 38.5 degrees for 60 minutes. Preferably, the training would have occurred in a heated room to match race 1's anticipated environmental conditions. When this was not feasible for the athlete, training was conducted in the hottest part of the day with an extra layer of clothing to force a rise in core body temperature and sweating. It should be noted that initial exposures to heat acclimatization training may require a reduction in duration and/or intensity from your usual training load. The training duration and/or the intensity should be progressively increased after around 3 days of heat acclimation to replace or replicate your race pace. During the initial 2 weeks, there should be no more than 1 rest day between exercise heat exposures. Training load metrics can be used to monitor load when combining heat training with normal training to avoid excessive training stress. In this example, once heat acclimated, the athlete engaged in around 30 to 120 minutes of exercise heat exposures every 4 to 5 days throughout the final period of time to the final race. These exercise heat exposures can be either continuous or interval training using controlled heart rates or self-paced methods to meet training needs. Interestingly, passive heat stress immediately following exercise in temperate conditions, this means warm baths or hot water immersion, may also help to maintain heat acclimation when an exercise heat exposure would compromise the training schedule. So what is the evidence for warm baths or warm hot immersion? As we have seen, it is possible that exercise heat exposures can be replaced with passive heat exposure using a sauna, warm bath or hot tub. Following intense training bouts in cooler temperatures to sustain training quality. Let's look at the evidence examining whether daily hot water immersion after exercise in temperate conditions induces heat acclimation and improves endurance performance. So, in this study, 17 non-heat acclimatized males performed a 6-day intervention involving a daily treadmill run for 40 minutes in normal conditions around 18 degrees, followed immediately by either hot water immersion or thermal neutral immersion, so from 40 degrees or 34 degrees for around 40 minutes. Before and after the 6-day intervention, participants performed a submaximal treadmill run for 40 minutes at around 65% of VO2 max, followed by an all-out treadmill time trial. In temperate conditions for this time trial, and also hot conditions. So, the hot water immersion induced heat acclimation demonstrated by low resting core temperature during submaximal exercise tests in both 18 and 33 degrees. Skin temperature, sweating onset, and rate of perceived exertion, so how your athlete is feeling, were also lower during submaximal exercise in both 18 and 33 degrees after the 6 days of hot water immersion. Physiological strain and thermal sensation, so how you're feeling in the heat, were also lower during submaximal exercise in 33 degrees after 6 days of hot water immersion. Interestingly, hot water immersion improved time trial performance in 33 degrees, but not in the 18 degree temperatures. So, thermoregulatory measures and performance did not change in control conditions. However, hot water immersion after exercise on 6 days may present a simple and practical and also effective heat acclimation strategy to improve endurance performance in the heat. We have considered heat acclimatization strategies and ways in which you can apply this to your training in the long term. But what about the short-term acute strategies that you could use before hard exercise in the heat? One is pre-cooling. Within the literature in sports science, pre-cooling usually comes with a few common strategies. These include cold water immersion, ice slurry ingestion, cooling garments, or a mix of these methods. The objective of these pre-cooling methods is to start the body's core body temperature lower so that the exercise can last longer before core body temperature hits a critical point and you begin to reduce your pace. You can see this in this graphic. Clearly in this study, those who are pre-cooled lasted significantly longer than those in controlled, neutral conditions, as well as those who were already hot before exercise began. So, what strategies could we use? Let's look in detail at a study looking at the effects of crushed ice ingestion as pre-cooling method on a 40-kilometer cycling time trial performance. 17 trained male subjects underwent a familiarization trial and 2 experimental 40-kilometer time trials, which were preceded by 30 minutes of either crushed iced ingestion or just simple tap water consumption. The cycling time trial required the athletes to complete 1,200 kilojoules of work on a wind-brake cycling ergometer. During the cycling time trial, gastrointestinal and skin temperatures were calculated. Cycling time trial performance was measured, power output, heart rate and blood lactate were also measured as physiological measurements. Rate of perceived exertion and thermal sensation were measured as feelings, and these are all measured at set intervals of work. Pre-cooling lowered the gastrointestinal temperature after crushed ice ingestion, significantly more than tap water. The difference remained evident until 200 kilojoules of work was completed on the bike. No significant differences existed between any other conditions at any time point for skin temperature, heart rate or RPE. The cycling time trial completed was around 6.5% faster in the ice ingestion time trial when compared with the tap water. The authors concluded that crushed ice ingestion was effective in lowering gastrointestinal temperature and improving subsequent 40-kilometer cycling time trial performance. So, what about cooling garments? The application of cooling garments may have practical limitations. Garments likely restrict movement, increased air resistance, and result in subsequent drag. Further, the positive cooling effects may not prevail over the additional weight to the athlete, which can have a detrimental effect on endurance performance. And current research on the application of heavy ice vests assessed using stationary cycling performance did not consider these limitations that occur in the field. Further research is needed on a lightweight cooling garment that minimizes such consequences, which still improves the cardiovascular and perceptual responses to endurance exercise. Another important consideration with cooling garments is the use of some of these strategies may be against regulations of certain sports. So when we look at pre-cooling as a whole, we aim to reduce core body temperature before exercise while subsequently increasing heat storage capacity. However, you need to consider if these pre-cooling strategies are practical for you and your situation. Furthermore, we need to acknowledge that there are possible adverse risks and or limitations to these strategies. Please be aware of these before conducting any pre-cooling strategies. During your race, know where the cooling opportunities may present themselves. Ultra trail running races are conducted over a long period of time, often through the whole day and night. Daytime adds extra stress on your body due to the higher temperatures. Ensure that you are wearing a hydration pack, know where your water and aid stations are along the race route, and take plenty of fluids with you. Going into the night actually may provide you with some cooling opportunities where the temperatures will likely be lower. Furthermore, it could be that your race is conducted at altitudes, therefore again will be significantly reduced in temperature. Often on the trail, you will run past rivers, down creeks, or through vast valleys. These areas may provide you with an extra area for cooling. If wide enough, run down the side of the trail or path that is most in the shade to reduce the solar radiation. While not a cooling opportunity, another important point to make is travel to your race. Ensure sufficient recovery from your flight and acclimatization to your environment, especially if you're traveling long haul and to a new type of environment. Furthermore, make sure you are fully hydrated again before conducting any intense exercise. So, key points to consider. If you plan to conduct heat training, it is important to periodize when you will conduct hot training sessions to fit with your training schedule, plan, and daily life. There are a range of different pre-cooling strategies that you can apply to your training and racing. However, it is important to consider if these strategies are practical or not. Furthermore, if they are actually allowed during races. And finally, consider your environment, especially during the long ultra trail running races. Use it to your advantage.